And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at coalition_radio. Well, if you spend as much time as I do now on Smith Hill, you will understand that the last week or so, there has been this incredible rite of passage where all sorts of legislation is considered that impacts virtually every aspect of Rhode Island life. Not the least of which was the passage of landmark legislation. When I say landmark, that's a term that's often abused, often used. But in this case, in the state of Rhode Island, we will be the home of the first in the nation set of harm reduction centers. A pilot program is going into place where we will have in our community what most consider the leading response to an opioid epidemic that has quite frankly swamped this country and the world. Joining me tonight is Haley McKee, no stranger to the program. She is the co-chair of the Substance Use Policy, Education, and Recovery PAC, a.k.a. the Super PAC. They played an instrumental role in steering this legislation, and I'll call this legislation a 3 to 5 year overnight success. Because, as we'll discuss tonight, legislation like this just doesn't happen. You don't get a group of people saying, hey, that's a great idea. Yeah, that's a ticket. And then they knock heads for a few hours and pass something of this complexity, this nuanced, this powerful, this impactful. It just doesn't happen like that. And full disclosure, I consider Haley McKee a close friend. And through her eyes this past year, I have seen the challenges, the hours, the work that goes into, and I'm probably understating it for once, changing in almost every manner the way that we interact with, that we rescue, that we offer sustenance to, that we change the lives of folks who are in a variety of stages of recovery from virtually every type of substance known, starting with opioids and moving into a range of drug challenges. We have, as a society in Rhode Island, I think, largely moved to the realization that folks impacted by substance abuse are not any one of the number of cliches or titles that we accord to them. They are our brothers, our sisters. They are on our softball team. They bowl with us. They go to church with us. They are in school with us. Very often, we've never even known that they face these challenges in their lives. And there was a moment last week when this bill was passed and signed into law that we saw finally the beginning of a sea change in how Rhode Island works with folks who face these often lifelong challenges. The beginning of a dream when ultimately we would not use incarceration, we would not use the criminalization of an illness and a challenge. We would instead seek to channel what resources we have and we can towards people who are part of our Rhode Island family to help them recover. Haley McKee, welcome back to the Coalition Radio Network. How are you tonight?
Well, Pat, thank you for having me again. I think you refer to me as a repeat offender. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine. Yes, you are a repeat offender. And first of all, congratulations. I want to talk a little bit tonight about the process, how, and it's generically, how, as we say, the sausage is made. But I know the sacrifices that you and AJ and the folks at a variety of organizations have made to bring us to this moment in Rhode Island. And it is protected. It is a major moment. And as been said a number of times in the last weeks, we have to embrace these successes because the battles and the road is so long. But congratulations. I mean, as my kids would say, hella good job. How are you feeling about all this?
Thanks, Tom. Excited. I've seen how progress has been made on this, and um, we're a national first, and that is surreal. It feels surreal. There were a lot of people who put a great deal of work into making that happen, and I can talk about what that process looks like, what that looked like kind of on a ground level, and I'd be happy to do so. It was really complex. It took a few years to do what's become kind of a hat trick of bills that have passed to support people who are living with substance use disorder or people who use drugs, people in recovery, and just support that and save lives. So I'm happy to get into any one of these bills.
Well,
And I know that the harm reduction center bill is the hot one. So I'm happy to talk about that one.
yeah, and I want to focus on that tonight because we did some programming earlier today about this, and if the Coalition Radio Network, being not quite being the local NBC outlet or the CBS outlet, can offer value to the community, it's in having the time and the resources to really create a sense of understanding, to, as we like to say, to slay the urban myths, the confusion, the chaos, sometimes the intentional misrepresentation, and of course the outrage porn that seems to follow when society, governments, individuals, organizations affect real societal change or change the course as dramatically as these harm reduction centers represent. Because as I mentioned to an earlier guest, it really is a complete reversal of everything that certain generations have been taught regarding how you fight, quote unquote, fight drugs. And I come from a generation, and I smile when I say this, but it's a poignant smile where, I call it the French Connection model. Let's spend an enormous amount of resources on criminalizing human behavior. Let's spend an enormous amount of resources criminalizing the production of these materials, which has all sorts of, well, sometimes I cynically believe, anticipated and largely unanticipated results. You look at the war of drugs, and it is such an astonishing failure at every level, because fighting prohibition by trying to legislate behavior, the movie always ends the same way. We create a criminal element. That criminal element develops products and sells them at inflated prices. Very often, that same criminal element sells products which are laced or poison even more so than the original chemicals that were intended to be delivered. We create public health nightmares. In this case, since unlike say alcohol, where it was produced domestically, we've created a humanitarian nightmare in Latin and Central America, and forced countless families out of their homes because of narco-terrorism. The resources that are drained because of it's the pressure on a chaotic, confused immigration. I won't even call it a system. All of these are the result of a failed war on drugs, which has produced the same results unerringly now for 40, 50 years, and yet we don't change them. And then there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We see a little bit of hope when we see this type of legislation pass. So if you sort of take it from the beginning, and I know that we have to do a little bit of a top side because there's individuals involved who are, it's a complex situation. But give us a sense of the generation of the idea and what you had to do to bring this legislation to fruition.
So you're referring to the harm reduction center and pilot
Yep.
program? That
Yep.
one? Okay. So we set out collectively as a group a little bit better than 3 years ago. And I will say that Senator Miller played a huge part in this legislation. He's been championing it from the beginning. A lot of people don't understand that this bill passed unanimously a lot of sessions continuously for the last few years through the Senate side. So this isn't news on one side. So what I can gather is that we were sitting at a table at the Rhode Island Medical Society along with a lot of epidemiologists and emergency room doctors, people who are in recovery, building out this bill, writing this bill several years ago. And year after year, it was kind of discussed. There was a lot of interest on the House side, even under the last House Speaker, um, where House leadership wanted to go and take a plane to go and see one of these facilities. I believe this was about a year and a half ago. But COVID unfortunately shut that down, but there was a lot, they were really inquisitive. They wanted to see it. So as a lobbyist, I can say that working with senators who had passed this bill, they'd make conversation and say, hey, I saw an episode of Chicago Hoop or some network television show that highlighted this issue and in one of these facilities, and I want to talk about it. Or, the Senate president actually approached me and said, what's going on with these shooting galleries? What is it all about? And it was more questions than it was judgment. And on its face, it's very radical. So for people who are listening at home, this is a medical facility where people can bring pre-obtained illicit substances into a building and use under medical guidance. And that can be a variety of different substances. So in other countries, and there are more than 20 of them who have established this evidence-based practice, and there are 120 facilities around the world. People who utilize these facilities, they will consume these substances under medical guidance, and if something should happen to them, statistically, nobody, not a single person, has overdosed and died in one of these places. And while we don't push the recovery agenda, it often happens in these spaces. So in our current treatment model, there's spaces for people when they're willing to engage in recovery. But the giant loophole in America right now is that where a person's in active use, which is where they're at highest risk of overdose, the services don't really currently exist so much. So this really meets a person where they're at and provides them with some safety. It lowers infection rates for hepatitis C and HIV. And a lot of people segue into kind of a different level of care by utilizing these kinds of facilities. It's very radical on its face. And we understood this. I have a great deal of pride for our General Assembly and all the people who it took to get to this place where we became the nation's first, to really listen to the experts on this, listen to people who have survived this, listen to medical experts and epidemiologists, and really trust their opinions. And yeah, it's a very big deal for sure.
So when this was published, that this was passed, obviously it's a controversial subject. You've got a variety of responses to this. First of all, and again, sometimes my gallows humor may seem flip, but as we like to say where I come from, denial ain't a river in Egypt. You've got the denial that it's not happening in my community and that this is going to bring in people from those other communities. Number two, that you're going to see folks passed out in front of these buildings. That there will be if you will, a copycat impact where folks in the community will be exposed to a variety of drugs because of the existence of these buildings. First off, this approach, it's been successful in other parts of the world and in Canada. Is this simply a way to provide a safe harbor with information made available to folks who may finally be ready to enter some level of recovery? And how was this envisioned originally, and what takes place at these centers?
Okay, well, I would imagine that like there's this like stages of change model that we kind of operate within where it's pre-contemplative, contemplative, action, maintenance. I would say that these people are probably fearful of overdose. So as a former IV drug user, I can certainly relate to what that feels like, of being scared that you're going to overdose and die. I see these people accessing this facility to just keep themselves alive and safe. And I don't think as a society we should deny these people if we're acknowledging and recognizing that substance use disorder is a medical condition, denying people medical care. What's the second part of your question, Pat?
Well,
It was a twofer.
what actually physically takes place? What are the processes?
So a person,
Go ahead.
right. So it looks kind of like a DMV. It like to demystify it, there are like several booths in other countries where a person sits in front of a medical person. It could be a nurse, it could be a physician, and will consume their substances under medical guidance. So they're issued fresh syringes, and given conditions where they won't have any sort of contamination. It's not as exciting as people might think it is. It's not a rave, it's not a party. It's just people looking for a little bit of extra help while they're dealing with things.
What appears to be most shocking to quote unquote folks outside of this bubble, who many of whom may not be as far away or far removed from folks attempting to reach recovery as they may think, is the concept of people shooting up, that we're going to provide a facility for people to engage in illegality. Why are these centers so important, particularly with regard to the mechanics and the safety of drug use?
So I would kind of argue that we provide safe consumption facilities in the form of bars all over the city of Providence and all over the world. This is a social construct. So we have, as a society, have deemed certain substances less palatable to consume than others, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you look at tobacco, which kills, I believe, 500,000 people annually in the United States. I believe alcohol is number two. Fatal overdose would be number three, but for some reason we accept certain things. So there's no reason. It's just a social construct. So whatever people are consuming on any given day, and I would argue that sugar is probably up there too.
Mm-hmm.
That probably kills a great number of people as well. So it's we're not providing anything. And that's a big part of this. And we've heard a lot of pushback as far as this law's passage is concerned. So this will be privately funded via private donations, nonprofits, research. It won't be funded through taxpayer money. And we've heard the age-old argument of what about my EpiPens? What about my insulin? Why should I be paying for this? Death for dope dealers, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. We've heard this time and time again. But the reality is it's just like anything else, where if you don't need to access one of these facilities, then don't use one. If you are a person who needs to access one of these facilities and you're scared for your life, and you feel as though you need medical help for a medical facility, then by all means, Rhode Island will be the first place to provide you with one of these, which we're really proud of, because we're tired of losing people. 384 people in our small state died last year, and that's hit home for everybody. I don't know of many people who haven't been impacted by this kind of loss or known a 19-year-old person who's passed away from something that was preventable. And this is a way to get to that active use phase, active use stage, and offer people support, and meet them where they're at.
Speak to, if you can, the type of folks who will be working there. What level of medical attention will be there? What type of entree to recovery options will be there? What will the staff look like at one of these facilities?
Sure. So, I can't really speak to that because what's going to happen that this bill has passed is that they're going to appoint an advisory board of 9 people under the director of the Department of Health, who will include people from the League of Cities and Towns, uh, somebody from the Rhode Island Hospital Association, somebody from the AG's office or their designee, or Rhode Island Medical Society, the Rhode Island American Society of Addiction Medicine, a person with substance use disorder, an overdose prevention worker, a law enforcement official, and a family member of somebody who's lost somebody to fatal overdose. And those people who are really going to be reporting back over the next few months to the director of the Department of Health, rather. Sorry, my head's in the Department of Corrections, as to how to advise how this is going to be staffed. But it is going to be a medical facility, and what that looks like is going to be determined largely by that group and their expertise and where they land in the next
Hmm.
few months, which is extremely important.
So you've got a wide range of folks with input into this, including but not limited to the Rhode Island Medical Association. I want to read a quote from the AMA. By enacting the nation's first law in support of a pilot harm reduction center, Rhode Island is taking an important step to save lives from drug-related overdose and death, says AMA Opioid Task Force Chair Bobby Mukamala, MD. Again, emphasis MD. The AMA strongly supports the development and implementation of harm reduction centers in the United States. These facilities are designed, monitored, and evaluated to generate data to inform policies on the feasibility, effectiveness, and legal aspects of reducing harms and healthcare costs related to injection drug use. So, number one, you've been endorsed nationally, and your efforts, your organization's efforts, and the coalition that was created to create this efforts have been recognized nationally by the premier medical society in America. What other type of endorsements, and I would imagine too, you're getting a great deal of attention from the national media. Uh, what type of reactions and support have you gotten from other parts of the medical community?
Sure. So we're fortunate enough to have a great group of people from Brown University who are the world-class experts on this topic, who are literally right up the hill, which is a large part of why this bill is now a law. Um, and we're grateful for the epidemiologists who have really used their expertise in informing our General Assembly as to why this should pass. And that was helpful. We also have emergency room doctors, and I think Rhode Island has been really hard hit by this overdose epidemic, and that is a large part of the reason why this is now a law. Yeah, it's a lot to hear from the AMA that they put their stamp on it, and we've got people reaching out from all over the country to ask, how did you do this? And how did this work? Because this has been kind of an uphill battle in other states with a lot more support. But we had a real grassroots effort here in the state of Rhode Island, as well as a General Assembly who have people who are lawmakers who were really hard hit by this epidemic. And that was a huge reason why we came in first, which is
Right.
sad.
Well, and the bill sponsors, I believe it was Representative Edwards and Josh Miller were two of the primary sponsors. Who were some of the other folks who were key in the efforts to get the legislation passed?
Sure. So, just in conversations over the last few years, and we've had a lot of different conversations about a multitude of different drug policy agendas that we've had. There are a lot of people in personal recovery in the General Assembly, who a couple of whom have actually stood up and bravely spoken about that, which is not easy. There are people who have lost people who are close to them in the General Assembly. people with family members who have reached out for treatment, people who can relate. It's not a mystery that Rhode Island is just really very much impacted by this opioid epidemic, or this epidemic as a whole. So it's not even just solely opioids, but that was, I think, a big driving factor for this legislation.
Excellent. Now, as groundbreaking as this is, there are other efforts that you've been able to advance in cooperation with this broad coalition that the Super PAC has been instrumental in creating. Talk to us about some of the other legislation.
Sure. So Rhode Island just became the second state to decriminalize buprenorphine, as your prior guest was speaking about, which is also, it's a medically assisted recovery medication. Vermont was the first last month to decriminalize that. So that's a medication that is probably the closest thing to a silver bullet in this war against the opioid epidemic and overdose prevention. Um, so that's also another third year bill, I believe, that was Senator Miller's. And what we were finding, I believe it's 350 people every 3 years in Rhode Island were slapped with a felony conviction for being caught in possession of buprenorphine or Suboxone. And the problem with that was a lot of the people who were prosecuted for this or charged with this were charged in possession with their own medication. So this is a medically assisted recovery medication that is prepackaged in single doses, that doesn't have any identifying information on it. So a person who was actually a medical patient and a person who had bought it on the illicit market could have easily both been charged with felony charges, and that's what we were finding. So additionally, a person who obtains this medication within the illicit market is usually doing so to stave off withdrawal symptoms, because they're not able to access the regular channels. Treatment in Rhode Island is not what it's made out to be. It's very hard if you're uninsured, or if you lack access to transportation, or a lot of these people are just taking that medication off the street to stave off those withdrawal symptoms or to prevent overdose. And they found statistically in places such as Burlington, Vermont, where they had a police chief by the name of Brandon Del Pozo, who had a spoken wheel model, where they were basically having, sorry, I have a cat here, clinicians writing out scripts for 3 days at a time, and it reduced overdose death substantially out there, very substantially. So this is a medication that is, sorry, there's my cat Paul, who's stuck. Yeah. So that's decriminalized in Rhode Island, so people will no longer be prosecuted for being caught in possession of that medication, which should save a lot of lives. That kind of goes back to Operation Bust Out, which I don't know if you recall, Pat. Do you remember Operation Bust
Oh,
Out?
I do, but why don't you explain it to the listeners? What happened there?
So Operation Bust Out was a deliberate undercover drug sting down in Kennedy Plaza, maybe about a year and a half, 2 years ago, where they targeted 23 people, mostly who were people of color, and mostly who were arrested for, they had an undercover informant who probably had an axe over their head, who was pretending to have withdrawal symptoms and trying to appeal to people who were Suboxone patients. And many of these people were arrested, publicly shamed, charged with felony possession with intent, held over the Christmas holiday for what was often a $3 or $5 transaction. So, sorry, there goes the cat again. He'll be back again. So that was kind of Operation Bust Out. So that's the decriminalization of buprenorphine, which is excellent, which we're excited about. Because we know when that medication gets diverted into the, go ahead, Pat,
we probably shouldn't have to, but if you can give folks a sense of the life-changing aspects of being a convicted felon, when in fact you've committed no crime against anyone. I hate the term victimless crime. I'm working to get that out of the lexicon, if you will. But when there's no aggression, no force, no violence, no malfeasance, and you're simply engaging in a behavior that at that point in time the state had decided to frown on, what does that do to someone once they become a felon?
Well, it robs them of their social determinants for a very long time, which is your access to housing, employment, and education. And you're absolutely right, Pat. So, like you're right. We need to come up with a better term than victimless crime, because at its best, it's or worst, it's self-harm. And this is just people self-medicating or using drugs recreationally. But the war on drugs is essentially a war on race and class. It's law enforcement's bread and butter. Felony possession, which we can get into next if you'd like to,
Yeah,
is
please.
the most utilized felony charge in not only the state but in the country, and that's what's led to mass incarceration, which is big business, right? Which creates people, that makes them stock, and creates infrastructure for the corrections, the corrections department. It keeps people in work, in business, much at the expense of the general public. So I don't even want to go into the support not punish model or whatever, because I don't even like to make the assumption that everybody who's using substances or is in possession of substances has a substance use disorder. And I think that's a very kind of misguided conversation, where we shouldn't be questioning that, where it should be full bodily autonomy, where people are not prosecuted for putting things in their own body. People are not jailed for putting things in their own body. People are not ordered into diversion courts for putting things into their own body, or ordered into treatment for putting things into their own body. It's The whole system needs to get overturned, and we're very much trying to do that by trying to decriminalize these substances and make it where the government does not have a say over what people do with themselves, basically.
Well, you know how I feel about that as a libertarian, right? Full disclosure. Um,
As a
I,
libertarian myself, I agree, Pat. Yes.
yeah, it's in some aspects of our lives we've embraced bodily autonomy. Others, we need to understand in a variety of social constructs that we are, if you will, the possessors of our own domains, and it is up to us to dictate on an individual, personal basis through personal choice how we choose to use that, and whether certain elements of society may determine that use to be good or bad, frankly, has no relevance whatsoever to said individual. None. And to use the state to cruelly attack the individual for their own personal choices, which cause no harm to others, is beyond the pale for me. Absolutely beyond the pale. And it is the center of every political belief that I hold. How is, without getting into the real nitty gritties, I mean, again, we're looking at a sea change in everything we do about, if you will, the quote unquote enforcement of drug laws. How has law enforcement community adopting to this new reality? Because it's really, you talk about breaking through that glass ceiling. This is a punch through the
Right.
whole of it.
Yeah, they're effing terrible. And, whether they adapt or not is really none of my concern personally. We make the laws, they just have to abide by them. And we see on a community level that they don't typically do that. They violate their laws they never came to the table. And it took this long for these laws to get passed, particularly the defelonization of drug possession charge should have passed a couple of years ago. But our friends over at the Police Chiefs Association have been pretty much a Death Star in preventing it and doing so. So I read a comment by Sid Wardell, who's the director of the Police Chiefs Association, where he stated after the passage or of the one of these bills, I believe it was the defelonization bill, once it got out of a floor vote on the House, that he said it took a long time for law enforcement to get to a place where they embraced this as a disease, I believe he said. But the fact of the matter is he never did. And, you know, that was just one of those things where they've got a fractured organization where their police chiefs can't agree on anything. And they fought tooth and nail to make sure that no version of this bill passed at all. And if it were up to them, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now, Pat.
Right.
So the idea that they're saying it took them a while, they still haven't gotten there. But fortunately, because we make policy, they have to follow our laws and they don't have a say. And that's going to be key there. At no point did they come to the table with solutions. At no point have they been anything but an obstacle in the last few years. They have not acknowledged the racial inequities of their practices. We'll APRA data quite regularly and see that as much as 88% of people who are arrested with felony possession with intent in the city of Providence are people of color on any given month, despite the fact that Black people and white people use drugs at the same rate, and Providence is only about 16% Black. But their police forces do that, and they fail to acknowledge the injustices that they're doing in the systemic racism that they're perpetuating. And in better states, where they have less formidable police unions, the police unions have actually gone to public health and asked them, you know, there are people in our communities that are actually dealing with stuff and we're overrun and they're hurting. How can we get some help? In Rhode Island, that has not been the case.
Right.
So, you know, in actuality, you know, they said one thing in print. They said they stayed quiet on the buprenorphine bill and the harm reduction centers bill. I'm not so confident about that. I don't think that it was on the radar, because I think had it been, and fortunately these bills have passed, that we might have had some serious opposition, which is unfortunate, because they believe that the stick works. They believe that the carrot and the stick works.
Mm-hmm. And we know, just on an issue that you and I have worked on together, that is sadly the culture of big police, what I'll call big police here in Rhode Island, that there is much driven by the pursuit of the holy dollar with regard to overtime and all the different associated costs, many of which accrue in part to them, with regard to their philosophies on things like solitary confinement, and of course just about anything they can do to feed that pipeline to prison. It would appear in Rhode Island that the pipeline to prison is a gigantic vacuum cleaner that's laid out to ensnare as many folks as possible. And those are the subtleties, by the way. When you talk about the thin blue line, and when you talk about policing in this state, the reason why there is so much animosity is because, and this is statistics. It's not, this is not conjured up by a group of people looking for special treatment. What happens simply is that laws are perverted in order to ensnare a group of individuals indiscriminately. It's undeniable. And yet folks will stare us all in the face and say, we don't need to readjust financing priorities for the police. That's secret code word, Haley, for defund the police. We don't need to radically alter policing. That's another secret code word for ending the police. And re-engineer policing so that it's a bottom-up community-based model. That's another code word for ending the police. Translations, folks. They and because of the effort that they place into public relations, which is a nice translated word for spin and bullshit, they, instead of putting those efforts into community policing, racial tensions, violence, classism, racism is at an all-time high. And quite frankly, all one had to do is look at people's reactions from the Sales Avenue incident. So I don't know that I'm overly optimistic, except for the fact that yes, they are, as they've reminded us. Haley, how many times have you been reminded that police simply enforce the laws passed by the legislature? How sweet is it?
Well, they don't, right?
Well,
They
right.
don't, and that's the grim reality of that. I can say as far getting back to the war on drugs, because that's why we're here, right?
Right.
And that in itself is a huge lift. I can say, I want to speak on something that your prior guest had said. These police are not overdosing from vicarious fentanyl exposure. There's no such thing as like absorbing fentanyl subcutaneously from people who are using drugs. So that's the police basically flipping a narrative and saying, because we're doing our jobs on state taxpayer money and jumping on overdoses, which they typically won't do. They'll typically wait for an EMS to arrive before, rather than administering naloxone. That's not happening. And also the narrative from your prior guest, and I think that this is extremely important, and I want to make sure that I balance this. The whole narrative within white communities of, well, this impacts everybody. It's not just that needs to stop, right? Because communities of color have paid the price for decades now, and they faced mass incarceration because of. And the feedback that I've gotten from some people as far as our white opioid epidemic is that this isn't fair. And it's not fair because it took white people dying for people to start paying attention to the war on drugs. And this has been decades in the making, but it's only gotten traction in the last few years. And I want to make sure that people understand that with these harm reduction centers, white people are able to access treatment, and historically, people of color will go to prison. And with the defelonization bill, which is absolutely my favorite of the bunch that has passed this year, is the one that's going to have the most community impact. Is as sensationalized as the harm reduction center bill is, right? And it's very exciting. The one that's going to start to make things right. And I don't even know that that's going to be possible I don't even know that there's a way to repair the war on drugs and the impact that it's had on a lot of different people and communities. The defelonization of simple drug possession is something that I hope to expand in the next year, and hope that people recognize is the one that is the most vital to undo the war on drugs, for sure.
Absolutely. Well,
So the conversation of not just these people that needs to stop. And it's, look at Kristen's law, Pat, right? Kristen Kutu. And they put a black man in prison for a very, very long time for what was a consensual act. They took a white girl from Cranston. And that was 3 years ago.
right.
And they made an example out of him. And that's your war on drugs.
And I want to let that just hang there for a second or two. So what's next? We go into an implementation stage of these harm reduction centers. There again, I'm going to relentlessly attack these urban myths that have popped up in the last week or so. One of which was that by one media person that people hadn't done their homework when putting this into place. As you pointed out, and the American Medical Association has, and the Rhode Island Medical Society has, the investment in time, the investment in scientific expertise on this is unfathomably deep. Some of the leading epidemiologists on the planet we are privileged to have here in Rhode Island. And some of the finest medical traditions on the planet exist here in Rhode Island because of the presence of the Brown University Medical School. These folks, as you pointed out, are going to be intimately involved in moving forward this, both in the application and the the data that will arise from that. How important is it, the data and the studies that they're going to be able to make in terms of ongoing research in how to aid people in recovery? How important is that as a part of this entire project?
Sure. So we've got Dr. Brandon Marshall up at Brown University at their School of Public Health, and people such as Dr. Jody Rich and Dr. Tracy Green, and people who are literally at the forefront of all this world-class research. And I think to be able to, and I know a lot of these people have actually traveled to different countries to actually study these different models, to actually have it at home and inform other states, try to dial back some federal laws, hopefully, at some point. Hopefully, we'll get to a point where cannabis is kind of veered to as a result of these harm reduction centers, and see what's working. Use it to inform like how to save lives. And that's essentially what we're trying to do with that harm reduction thing. We're very, very spoiled in Rhode Island, in having all of these incredible people. And we also have a strong recovery presence as well. And I want to make sure that those people are acknowledged because we've got these outstanding survivors who are outreach workers who are out on the streets doing work every single day and are able to use their lived perspicacity to, in turn, kind of really kind of pay it forward and save other people's lives who are also informing this work. So we've just got this like perfect little petri dish of people who are experts in every single dimension, who I believe are going to play a big role in the success of this first harm reduction center or centers. Because the way that the bill is written, we can have more than one. It could become like Dunkin' Donuts in Rhode Island, where they're on every street corner, right? It
Right.
won't happen, but um, there's a possibility for more than one of these places across the state or multiple places, depending on need. And I believe that that advisory committee is going to make a sound determination as to what that looks like going forward. So you can expect by March 1st or sooner that we'll have some answers as to where this is going to be, and what that's going to look like. A lot of people have worked very hard on this for a very long time, and I don't expect that we're going to lose any steam or slow down at this point.
Well, and in certain cases, I don't think I'm overstating it when I talk about this program and associated efforts literally being a life's work for some for folks, associated with Albert Medical School, with associated with Brown University, associated with the various organizations surrounding this. This is literally their life's work, and I often speculate as to whether Rhode Islanders appreciate the medical community with which they're surrounded. There are there are many parts of this country, because of geography, population, who are suffering from the same issues, but simply don't have at their fingertips, literally, the type of programs, the type of structure, the type of culture that embraces these type of recovery efforts. So do they? I mean, we're in a pretty unique spot here, aren't we?
Very much so. Very much so. Like I said, we're a small community. I can't think of another state. Like I think if we were living in like Texas or California or somewhere giant, how hard, how much more difficult it would be to bring together all of these pieces where everybody's literally in the same room, and able to engage regularly or able to connect. Or there's something to be said, and I can't wait to get back in that General Assembly and reconnect with a lot of the lawmakers and see a lot of the like community advocates and all the people who have played a huge part in all of this progress, be able to come back to Smith Hill, and be able to chat these people up again because we're in a unique position where you're able to do that here. And I believe that it's another reason that we've been able to have some impact and some success in
Right.
the sense that everybody's at like basically on each other's back doorsteps, and we see each other and we're able to coordinate and go to these weird political fundraisers, or just, a lot of the lobbying that I do is actually at Whole Foods. I see a lawmaker there every single time I go and get a loaf of bread, and that is just very specific to Rhode Island. And I
It's
think that's why we've been moving.
I was going to say
Yeah.
7 stars as policy incubator, right? The, well, and again,
Hmm.
you
The
talk about,
Broadway one, or
well, there's the Broadway one, there's the Hope Street one. They each have their own unique flavor. But again,
yeah.
it's listen. There aren't many places where you're going to casually run into the governor at Whole Foods, or the prior governor. I say the
Mm.
current governor is more of, I think, market basket
He's a
stop and
Dave's
shop.
Market guy.
Yeah, he
He's
absolutely
a
does.
he's a Dave's. He's got to be a Dave's Market guy.
All right,
Yeah.
and I say that to his eternal credit. Somebody like Jody Rich, Dr. Jody Rich, if you could talk about his
Hmm.
influence, because it is profound, his life's work, if you could for a minute.
Sure. So Dr. Rich is a person who has worked behind the walls at the Department of Corrections for, I believe, decades. I believe he works at the Transitions Clinic and treats people who are living with various infectious diseases such as hepatitis C and HIV.
Right.
He was also one of the pioneers to implement medically assisted recovery medications such as methadone, naltrexone, and Suboxone behind the walls at the ACI so they could treat people for substance use disorder. And they were the first in the nation to do so. And he's been a very good voice for what's possible in other parts of the country, and very much been a first. And he's always been very helpful when there's been an opportunity for testimony to push any of these bills or support any of these bills. Dr. Rich has always been on board, and we're greatly appreciative for that.
Hmm. So where do we turn from here, Haley McKee? I know that a brief vacation is in order between now, if you will, at some level somehow. Uh, you have been you as we've spent the last 40 minutes or so talking about all these different community heroes. You are one as well. You know, your
As are you,
ability.
Pat.
Well, no, but your years now of dedication, your lobbying efforts, your personalization, if you will, of this battle into your everyday life, is remarkable. Are you going to take a little time to just revel, despite all the challenges that
No,
life offers us? You're going to take a couple of days to
no,
just celebrate. I you know,
no. I don't see it. There's we've got some stuff to do. We've got a solitary confinement bill to end.
yep.
We've got to end the abuse of solitary confinement behind the walls and shut down that supermax prison. Hopefully, send the women home from the ACI. Um, we've also got some great ideas for a lot of other different bills. I want to start talking about drug dealers because sorry, I gotta kick my cat off the table again. Um, because they're currently looking at sentences between 30 to 50 years for what's essentially like a consensual act. And I want to start talking about that next year. And we're going to be having a series of community meetings as an organization to find out what everybody else wants to take a look at. Yeah, we're not done. I mean, it's infinite. Pat, the work is infinite, and there's just so much more that we can do. I mean, not to say that I'm not grateful for um, the progress that we've made this year, and I'm really super grateful to lawmakers. And I know for a lot of viewers, they're not going to understand when we say that, but I can say firsthand that these people who pass these bills are good humans. And even the ones that didn't vote in favor of these bills, I'm sure that there's humanity there too as well. Um, but I have faith in this process, and I want to keep going with it. And I really love our team of people who have been working on all these things for years. And it really took a lot of people to show up and lobby and testify and write postcards. And these are massive efforts. Policy is a long game, it's a marathon, and it's not a sprint. And we don't know going into any session if anything's going to stick at all. We've gone home with our tail in between our legs the last few years. We're delighted to know that what the General Assembly decided to do this year is most certainly going to save lives. It's going to have an immediate effect on people's quality of life, their social determinants, their access to healthcare, and hopefully the way that they're received in the world, because everybody deserves to be received with respect and integrity, and dignity. And that was our goal when we set out, and we're continually working towards it.
Well, I know the high side battle looms large for a lot of us. You know, our little network here is committed to doing whatever we can to assist in the closure of that building. I'll take every opportunity I have to remind every lawmaker I meet, every individual I meet, that the state of Rhode Island is in violation of the Mandela rules, which leaves us in the unenviable position of being a state that supports state-sponsored torture. Yeah, that may sound harsh to people. Oh, well, tough shit. We are a state that supports torture. And we have government institutions which are constitutionally ordained to prevent the use of cruel and unusual punishment in its legal structures. And the irony, if you will, that a state police, if you will, force a state police mechanism, and by that I mean the entire police mechanism of the state, can act in a manner to support torture. And I have yet to see any deathbed conversion by the highly militarized police forces in this state to embrace that knowledge, while at the same time incarcerating individuals for far less heinous acts is a brutal reminder to how oppressive law enforcement in this country has become. And again, if you don't like it, sadly it's the facts. And
Well,
when I,
you know what, Pat, it's not a fact. It's just time to burn it down, right? It's time to burn it down and start from scratch. And that's my opinion.
yeah,
Yeah.
I see nothing redeeming in how we enforce the, if you will, very often unnecessary laws in the state. We talked about eliminating the victimless crime terminology. We'll have to come up with something. You'll have to help me come up with something better. So I look forward to.
Well, we won't have them. We won't, Pat, that's the thing. They won't be crimes anymore, right?
Mhm.
We just decriminalize, and then they're not victimless crimes. They're just not crimes at all. And that's our aim. And there's a couple of other things, such as prostitution. That's another one that needs to be addressed, right?
Right.
That would fall under that umbrella, which should no longer be a crime as well. So.
Well, the notion that as I mentioned to our guests earlier, that we are employing the same techniques in the quote, what I've determined is the war on sex work and sex workers, that we've done such a great job in the war. I mean, literally, it's a copycat. We are copycatting the techniques that were used in the grotesquely failed war on drugs into the war on sex work. State-sponsored, if you will, invasions of privacy, state-sponsored terror, state-sponsored torture, state-sponsored everything. We just fail to understand again and again and again that you cannot legislate behavior. And you have no, if we're going to support body autonomy, then quite frankly, if the individual chooses to use their physical body, whether it be for sports or for sex work or whatever, if in fact that is their choice, they are not the victims of coercion, then we need to allow them to do that. So I listen.
Agreed.
I look forward to continuing to engage on the field of battle with you. I'm gonna get a little sentimental here. You are a not only a force to be reckoned with, but you are a force to be admired. So I look forward to being behind you on that charge up the hill. Whatever it takes, right? So
Likewise.
let's get geared up and again take a day, and then
Armor up, Pat. Armor up.
let's get geared up to resume the fight. How about that?
Will do. Sounds good.
All right, buddy.
Thanks,
Well,
pal. It's
no,
nice
hey,
to see you.
no, it's nice to see you. We should see each
Love
other
you lots,
more
pal.
often.
I agree.
You literally the other day carried my water and my umbrella. So
That's true. That is true. Yeah.
that is clinically accurate. So Haley McKee of the Super PAC has joined us tonight to sort of provide additional background for what has been a night filled with conversation about recovery. It's a subject that we will continue to cover, utilizing the gracious offers of subject matter experience and expertise that so many folks in this community have been willing to do. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage-porn free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. If you could take a moment, if this is the first time you've heard us or the 100th, if you could take a moment and like us, share us, subscribe to us, all that stuff. Social media continues to be the avenue for which independent media, and we are a state replete with high-quality independent media. The Steve Alquists of the world, the Bill Bartholomew's of the world, Motif Mag. We are blessed here in the state of Rhode Island that at a time when the media is largely in decline, there exists a cadre of independent voices which will present to you more often than you might want the untold stories, the hidden truths, the lies, and the stories of redemption that are Rhode Island. Have a wonderful evening, and we will see you tomorrow night. We should have a live episode of Pump Up the Volume at 7:30. Eyes on Pawtucket at 8:30. On Wednesday, of course, Tina, Real Access Motivates Progress, Chas Kalenda, Attorney at Law, and Thursday night, of course, the Golf Guys. Have a wonderful evening.